Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion on laying the foundations for remote success. This is a lead dev webinar, and it's created in partnership with Shopify. So FYI, this webinar is going to last roughly 45 minutes, after which with myself and our panelists here, we'll head over to the lead dev Slack channel to answer some of your questions in the remote working channel. So that's #remote-working. I'm Neha Batra, and today I'm joined by four awesome panelists. Jay Shirley, who is the Remote Hub and Tech Enablement Lead from Stripe. Allison Malloy, who's a Senior Development Manager from Shopify. Christina Kemmer, who's the Director of Engineering from Zapier. And Swati Vatherin, who's the VP of Engineering from Buzzfeed. I also wanted to point out that a remote panel wouldn't be complete without a demonstration of Wi-Fi problems, and I volunteered for that. So I'm without Wi-Fi today. I'm tethering to my phone, and that means that you might see me come in and out. And so if that happens, Swati's volunteered to tap in as moderator. So that's just, part of what we offer you as a panel today. So anyway, let's talk about the panel. Today, we're going to talk about working remotely and especially doing it well, which is much easier said than done. And we have representation here, as you know, from Shopify, Stripe, Buzzfeed, Zapier, and GitHub, which is the company that I work at. All these companies have very different products and different ways of working, which means that it only makes sense that to make it successful, we found and adopted very different solutions and processes. And so today we're going to talk about the similarities and the differences in our solutions through questions on remote first culture, unblocking your work, supporting your team remotely, parenting, hiring, and talking to your company about maybe doing this permanently. There is a really wide landscape to cover here in our panel, so let's get started, and then we're going to do some introductions. And I ask that for our panelists, as you introduce yourselves, please share how long you've worked at your company, how long you've been working remotely, and how long, and like whether you deal with multiple time zones, and then finally, like what medium you spend most of your time. So I'm going to go first. I'm a director at GitHub. I've been working remotely for about 3 years, for the full time at GitHub as a manager. And so that means pre-pandemic and during. And previously I've worked only remotely through the nonprofit Right Speak Code. And I was overseeing 5 chapters. So it was like not exactly work related, but I had a little bit of experience. And so both with Right Speak Code and at GitHub, I've managed within US time zones, but at one point I was managing a team between Sweden, the US, and Australia, which kind of covered the entire workday. So today, as a director, my managers are kind of on the East Coast and the West Coast, but our full department ranges between UK and New Zealand. So you can see that there's like a lot of interesting intricacies of that. And to go with that, in order to work with people, we work through Slack conversations, GitHub discussions, Google Docs, and occasionally recorded Zoom all hands. And I still spend most of my days in meetings, but I try to follow up with written notes in a doc and a recording or some sort of source of truth to refer back to. So when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, I was familiar with working remotely, but up until then I was the only one who's working from home. So one of my biggest changes in the last year has been working remotely along with everyone else in the house. I'm going to pass it over to Swati to introduce herself.
Thanks, Neha. Hey, everyone. I'm Swati Vatherin, VP of Engineering at Buzzfeed. I've been at Buzzfeed for over 5.5 years, and I currently run the consumer-facing engineering teams, building all of our flagship products, BuzzFeed.com, our apps, Tasty, BuzzFeed News. At Buzzfeed, we've always had this concept of distributed offices, even before I started. And my teams are at a minimum across 4 time zones, but at any given day, you can have somebody somewhere else. And of course, the past year has even changed that even more. I started working remotely in some way after I had my first child. I said I wanted to work remote at least once a week. And then that transitioned to twice a week after I had my second child. And we've been able to leverage a lot of tools to make this something that is accessible to everyone. So we leverage Slack, GitHub, Google Docs. We leverage Google Meet for our video conferencing. Newer tools that I recently started working with this year or that last year have been Miro and Figma. And we still rely on the good old email. So that's a little bit about me. Thank you.
Yeah, I can go next. I'm Christina. I'm a director of engineering at Zapier. I've been there for just about 2 years now, and Zapier's been remote since its start. So that was pre-pandemic times as well. And then I've been working remotely for probably a total of about 4 years. So before that, I was at Envision, which is also completely remote. So so right now, my team spans from New Zealand to the UK. So my managers span there, and then their team span from Eastern Australia all the way over to Eastern Europe. So and everywhere in between. So there's a lot of time zone drift and not a lot of overlap sometimes. But what we try to do is actually keep the teams a little bit more geolocated. So like having some alignment with time zones. So we like to try to have about 4 hours of overlap within a team. So teams aren't stretched too thin. My wife and I have 3 young daughters. They're 6, 5, and 4. So for me, having an office with a door in the house is super important. But most of my day is spent in Zoom, Slack, various documentation tools like Google Docs, Coda, engineering docs, and GitHub. And then we also have sort of a homegrown wiki tool that is used for a lot of announcements and blogging and stuff like that. So that's where most of our time is spent. And I'll pass it to Allison.
Great, hi. I'm a development manager at Shopify, and I joined just over a year ago, so really just a few months before the pandemic hit. So I managed to experience life in the wonderful offices and then transition with the bulk of the company to working from home. Prior to joining Shopify, I'd actually worked remotely previously, and I had also had experiences managing teams in remote areas, so it wasn't all new to me. A few years ago, I had a team that was distributed between Norway and Canada, and our customer and testing site was in Singapore. So in that case, it was a pretty vast amount of time zones, and dealt with all the challenges and benefits because it meant somebody was pretty much working all the time, which was good. More recently, my team spread across different cities in Canada and the United States, and I spent a lot of time traveling. So I would spend 1 week a month or so working remotely from my home in Canada, and then I would spend 2 or 3 weeks visiting the 2 other cities and working with the teams on site there. So that was an interesting experience because I had a bit of everything. Now, despite having worked remotely now part of the time for about 4 years, I won the office lottery in my house where I have the office with the door because Shopify was really quick in the pandemic to say that we were going digital by default. So that was really good. But I still have it, it looks nice behind me, but in front, it's still a big mess. So one of these days I'll get to that. My current team spans Eastern time zone to Pacific time zone. So it's not a huge spread. That being said, we are used to being very co-located. So it is an adjustment and we're still working on that. And I would say for me personally, one of the big differences between my past experience and my experience right now is that we do everything on video. And before, even though we had the tools and used Zoom, everything was without our videos turned on. And it's a different change. I like seeing everybody's faces, but it's pretty tiring to be on all the time, as you all know. And right now we use a lot of the same tools as folks have been talking about. So Google Docs, we predominantly use Google Meet at Shopify, GitHub, Miro, Figma, and I might be a Slack addict, so I spend a lot of my day checking out messages there. I'll pass it to Jay.
Thank you. So I started working remotely back in 2006 and also corresponded to my son being born. And it was a kind of serendipitous moment where I had the opportunity and I was really excited to capture it. Back then, there wasn't a lot of opportunities for where you wanted to go work. And in 2015, I joined Stripe, which from their inception had supported remote work. Some of the first employees, they worked remotely, which was pretty cool. And I was impressed with how supportive they were in kind of growing and being very thoughtful about the experience of it and wanting to make sure that it wasn't about like individual experiences, but that we could kind of create a platform where people could succeed. And through that, we tried a couple different things. At one point, I was managing a team that we had 2 people in Europe and then a bunch in the US, and it was a 13-hour time zone spread, and that was pretty stressful. And then to make it harder, I spent my summers for probably 9 years working out of Japan, which meant I would wake up and start my workday at 2 a.m. I don't recommend that, but it's cool to be done with your work by like 11 or noon. My role now is as the remote hub site lead and then tech enablement. I have to work kind of across the entire technical org. And so even just this morning, I was meeting with people who were in Europe and in our Singapore office. And I'm grateful for I think this Singaporean representative won the latest meeting award coming in at 11 o'clock p.m., which is not great, but that's kind of the compromise you have to make. I think I spend the most of my time trying to get out of Zoom calls and get that into like whether a doc or some other sort of like collaborative medium that is not just kind of a blocking Zoom meeting. Meetings expand to fill the amount of time allocated to them, and it's oftentimes not the most like useful way. Still spend a ton of time in Zoom though, but really get into kind of collaborative document writing and editing. So whether it's Google Docs or paper, and then Slack is definitely a key part of my day. So that's it for me.
Well, thank you for that. So something interesting you can see is that our panelists, we have a really strong representation of parents on our panelists, which is why we're going to have some good questions about that coming up. And also we have this split between experience of working remotely before the pandemic and people who are experiencing it for the first time, or at least full time for it for the first time. And so I kind of wanted to establish some common ground, and let's start with an easy question. So it's one thing to work remotely, and it's another to embed that way of working into a company's culture. And so this question is for Swati and then Christina. What do you and your company do to create a remote first culture, and how is that different from when you used to be on site?
Thanks, Neha. Yeah, I mentioned that the tech team was distributed when I joined BuzzFeed, and I think the tech team at BuzzFeed has really been the driver for embracing like a remote first culture. You know, we were already using tools, collaborative tools that were digitally based. We were already doing video chats with our colleagues across various offices. And, you know, there were some lessons that we had to teach to the rest of the BuzzFeed organization on how to make this work and show them that this is just as great of a way of working as if we were on site. And so, you know, we did share lessons learned from tools that we use, introduce new tools that folks can leverage. One of the things that we've really embraced through this whole past year, and also hopefully moving forward, is just this concept of everybody being on video. I think in the past, you know, you had a handful of folks on video who were not in the office, and then everybody else was in the conference room all on one video, and it just kind of, you know, created this like this uneven sort of level of eye contact and collaboration that, you know, we all recognized was not best. And I think this whole past year has really allowed us to level that experience for everybody. Another thing that BuzzFeed has done to embrace remote culture is recognizing that remote culture is not just the way that you work, but how your work environment is set up. You know, what are the equipment that what you need, the type of camera, you know, the monitor, the chairs. And so they've actually provided a budget for everybody and a monthly stipend that folks get, and they can use that stipend however way they want, but they explicitly invested in that stipend so that folks can create the best remote experience for them in their own place. And I really thank them for thinking about that, because yes, it is something that, you know, does cost money and doesn't come for free. So yeah, I would say those are some of the things that we've been doing at BuzzFeed to create a remote first culture.
Nice. Yeah, that stipend I think is really important, and having suggestions of what equipment folks should buy to kind of have their home office. That's huge. I think at Zapier, just because we're remote first doesn't mean it's pain-free. So we still have a lot of pain points, but I would say some advice for going remote first is to really lean into documentation. Don't let Slack or Teams or other similar tools like that become your documentation store. That can easily happen. You know, select a tool that's going to be your source of truth. And it's fine to have stuff linking off of that, but folks need sort of one place to look first. And that's super important. Documentation also just doesn't mean written word, like really lean into like videos, diagrams, different ways that people can share information, because people kind of process information differently. It's easy to get sucked into like paragraphs and paragraphs of words when sometimes people are, that's just not how they learn. So decisions take a little bit longer to make. So the more localized you can make the decision, the better. I think is super important in fully remote. And for companies that are spread across time zones, especially, you know, the face-to-face synchronous meetings are really precious time. So use that time wisely, have an agenda, have a goal of the meeting, do pre-reading before the meeting so you're not setting context in the meeting and you can get to the good discussion in the meeting time. And then the last thing I'll say is that we're all still human. That human connection is super important. It's easy to kind of get lost. So companies setting up things like fun channels or ERGs or other ways to create community, even online community, is still super important and shouldn't be overlooked. So.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. It's so important, especially as like our life becomes just a little bit more monotonous between like walking between the bedroom and like our desk. Like there is ways to make things more fun. And one of the ways that I found that it's fun is to kind of explore new tools. And so I know that our designers at GitHub have been using a new tool called Loom, which allows them to showcase their designs and record a video alongside and then send it across to people to see what people think. And so it's really interesting that you can find new and interesting ways to recreate a design presentation or like the work that you're working on. So speaking of which, I want to talk about one of the most commonly mentioned difficulties when adjusting to remote culture, which is this ability that you don't have anymore, which is that normally you could just tap on someone's shoulder and you can get unblocked. And so I'm curious to hear from Allison and Jay, what are the ways that you've seen your teams and peers adjust to a more async way of getting unblocked?
Yeah, I think this is such a great question because I think we can all probably learn from each other. So I appreciate this. Some of the ways we've been doing it are really to embrace those async tools and different things and focus on using Miro and Jamboards as replacement for whiteboards. We do encourage that people do synchronous work with tools like tuple for pair programming, so we don't do everything async. We also use Slack integrations like Geekbot for stand-ups so that it's automated requests for your information and people can populate them as they go. We also have a meeting app called Fellow that allows us to capture meeting notes, which is quite helpful, and integrate the agendas and meetings, which as we heard is super important, and I agree. None of those things can really replace that whisper of a quick question or the things you might overhear when you're sitting beside people who are having a conversation. So in order to get around that, we really try to push people to share knowledge, ask their questions in public forums. You know, don't be shy. Even if you're brand new and you have questions that maybe you think are silly, they probably are super useful for somebody else to hear, and then it can actually engage a conversation. We can't get too comfortable having those conversations and important details in Slack though, because at Shopify, our Slack messages get auto-deleted after a couple months. So as Christina was saying, don't leave them there, pull them out. We have to put them into our internal wiki or Google Docs or wherever they go, but it's still really useful to have those conversations. There's also a better chance that more people will see your question. So if you're talking about like, oh, I need to know this answer right now, if you're doing that openly, then probably somebody will see it. I also tend to encourage people to do things in the moment. Like don't wait for a meeting to be happening. Do it now. Even if it does need to be a question that is answered live, just like take 5 minutes, don't waste people's time and then move on and get yourself unblocked. Some of the other things that we do are encourage people to over communicate. And that's, you know, I think an overused term these days, but it's so true. Like you cannot say things enough all the time and in different mediums enough. And that includes sharing your unpolished work. And that's one of the ways that we really encourage people to make sure that they're on that correct trajectory so that they don't get blocked or so we don't have to revert course later. So share unpolished thoughts and work products early, get that input, get that alignment, include notes about like what you're going to do next and what your thinking is and your level of confidence in what you're doing. And we've started to do things like when we share documents or demos or designs, we also include like accompanying videos, whether it's in a nice tool like Loom. I don't think we have too many of those, but even just sharing something on our screen where we do a pre-recording and we allow that to be shared by other people. And we record a lot of our meetings. So if you can't be there, that's okay, because you can watch it and catch up, and then you can have a conversation, join the conversation in the channels or the group.
I'm glad to hear that nobody has this figured out, because we don't either. One of the things that you mentioned, Allison, that is really key is don't wait for a meeting. This is something that I saw a lot of as we made the transition to more people working from home, is using the meeting as like the deadline to get the pre-work done and like the project brief done. And so what happens is people show up to the meeting and that's the first time that they had seen the work. And it tends to be over polished at that point as well. And so to your point, encouraging that behavior of sharing the kind of rough drafts and the first drafts that are out, but then also equally kind of reaffirming people have the agency to set decisions. This has been one of the key things that I've found is you have to continuously re-empower people to make decisions. Like, this is your project, you own the decisions. And I didn't see that as much when people were in the office. We operated kind of distributed because I think everybody was able to kind of discern from body language. Even if you were not in the room, you could still kind of pick up or get a sentiment from others. And so that how do you re-empower your technical leaders to continue to make those decisions and to do so quickly? Like, don't wait for the meeting. That's been something that I think that it's still a work in progress at Stripe, but we're really focusing on it. You know, and I mentioned in my intro, I try to get people out of Zoom, and some of this is trying to share practices. And two of my favorite, which I have shamelessly stolen from others, and one was an intern who felt really self-conscious about like constantly pinging somebody on Slack and said, hey, you know, I really like the scientific method, started a document up with, here is the question in the header, and then what they tried to do, what they expected, and then just kind of left it off. And they kept that doc up to date, and their team then would jump in and contribute their thoughts to the doc. And what happened was a really, really awesome doc about how our systems operated, and kind of highlighted that a lot of people had assumptions that, you know, they were correct 2 years ago, but they're not correct now. And that's the other thing, is that adding timestamps to your docs, or like, you know, this is relevant at this date, has been huge because, you know, I don't think Stripe is much different than any of the other companies here, that we move very quickly. And so it was true 6 months ago, you know, we've kind of changed some of the underpinnings for it. So adding the timestamps in there is really, really helpful. And one thing that just in the last month that we've tried to kind of hype up the keep trying new things, see what works, is using just an email subject of ready for feedback. So when somebody is sharing their first draft, they just add that in there, and then we can set up email filters to kind of bubble it up and make sure that we see it. And then one of the practices that we've had at Stripe for a long time, since before I joined, was when are we going to time out? So, you know, you get a 24-hour window to add feedback, and after that, here's what I intend to do. And so people who really care, they'll make the time for it. So you're kind of forcing prioritization. And then, you know, the other one is like, trying to break away from, do we really need to hop on Zoom? Do we need to schedule it? Can we just hop on for 5 minutes? Like, what happens if you agree to have a chat, but you're not going to chat for, you know, even if it's a speedy meeting, 25-minute block, just, hey, let's hop on Zoom until we get this hashed out. Maybe it takes 7 minutes. That's cool. And that's a behavior that I think people just need to start to practice, and then other people follow suit. So that's been what's working for us.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's definitely not lost on me how many times we've mentioned documentation so far, right? It's this concept of taking the concrete information, putting in a place that it's locatable. And I heard two new concepts that I'm actually going to take back with me. One is about sharing unpolished thoughts. I really love that one. And the other one is about adding timestamps to decisions, because you never know when the conditions change. So I'm going to take those two back for me from the panel. And so we talked about like taking the concrete information, putting it into place, and making meetings and async work a lot easier. But there's one area that kind of Jay touched on, which is reading body language, right? Like, what do you do when you want to understand how other people are doing? And I've noticed that, like, especially when it comes to big incidences, right? And like major events that are happening outside in the world. Like, I think the most recent one would be when the US protesters stormed the Capitol, right? I've noticed it's a lot harder to read the room when we're in a Zoom or in a video or a web chat or whatever we're doing, especially after big events, because people are reacting and being affected differently. So I wanted to throw this back to Jay and then Christina. What do you do in times of crisis to check in remotely and help people navigate their work?
No better question to ask in current times. It's just been kind of one thing after another. And I think first off is trying to check in and recognize with myself, how am I feeling? I've consistently found that, I'll be like on a Wednesday and just go like, whoa, I feel terrible. I probably have not been pleasant to work with over the last couple of days. So trying to raise self-awareness has been like an ongoing goal in my life, but in particular now. And then trying not to assume doom and gloom. Recognize it's probably hard for everybody, but if I interrupt somebody assuming that something is bad, maybe they are in like a much needed moment of flow and focus, and like I'm coming in, I'm like, hey, are you doing okay? Like, is this a hard time? That's probably not what they need or want from me. What they do want is that I'm very aware of kind of the overall context of their work. And when you're in an office, you can look around, you can kind of hear how people are talking, you can observe those conversations. The best that you can do, if you use Slack, is you search for all the messages that that person was sending. And then you have to guess, like, am I reading their sentiment correctly? Somebody today, they sent me over something. They were like, hey, I meant this sincerely, and it wasn't taken in a sincere way. They thought I was being sarcastic. And, it's that type of gap. And so when you're reading those messages and you go into it, it's easy to form this idea that there's a problem. And you just have to kind of stifle that and be like, okay, like, but what if everything is fine? Can this wait? Like, it's very, very important, but it may not be so urgent. And then bring that into a one-on-one that is very thoughtful, that you're saying like, okay, like, here's some stuff that's happening. I also really hate being asked, hey, how are you? Because it's just this phatic greeting right now. And you are like, do I really answer for real? Like there's a terrible pandemic raging. There's like so many problems. I like to just make it a little bit of a smaller question and start with, hey, how are you feeling this week? Or how are you feeling today? And it's interesting because when you say, how are you feeling rather than how are you doing, people actually stop to think about it. And what you care about is how are they feeling? Like, how are you doing is just kind of vague, but I care about your feeling, and then make sure that I'm really, really listening. And then if I have questions about, a Slack conversation that seemed particularly frustrating for them, it comes from this place of informed, like good intention rather than suspicion of, frustration, which it may not be. So, just kind of trying to keep drilling that in, and every morning check in with myself, like, how am I feeling? Because that's the first step, and then work on other people. What about you, Christina?
I think that resonates with me a lot. I think thinking about this question, it goes back to like, just because we're remote, we're still human, and building those connections are super important to be able to build the trust that somebody will be open with you, that like, actually, yeah, January 6th really impacted me, or like last summer I was having a really hard time, or I'm not feeling comfortable with how the company is responding to these things, things like that, like being really open with you. But that takes trust, and you have to build that. But I think, having Zapier, one thing I love about it, we have a culture of weekly one-on-ones, and especially last year and this year, going into this year, I've made it a point not to skip those. Like, even if it's a packed week, even if there's a lot of stuff going on or something, I try to find time to at least check in with folks. And I found myself trying to step back and really give others a lot of space. So if there's lots of pregnant pauses or space to just see what comes up, things like that. So it doesn't feel like, oh, I have to talk about work or I'm doing this, it's sort of, there's a little bit more flexibility there. The other thing that I have found is I changed my team meetings to be have a standing topic of wins and worries, so that the team actually talks about something that's gone well for the week and something that they're worried about for the week. And we all as a team vote on topics to talk through. So we talk through the top 3 of each category. And that could mean I got to hire somebody new on my team. I feel less stressed, and that's awesome. And we all get to celebrate that with them, right? It's such a minor, like, little thing, but at least they get to get that out, right? If it's a worry that's sort of a consistent worry, then we try to figure out, okay, what's one small step we can take? What's one small thing that we can kind of have in our control to move forward on? I try to do monthly skip levels with my teams as well, to keep connected with the engineers and ICs on the teams. That's also very open. So it's a pretty open agenda as far as like, you tell me what's top of mind for you, what keeps you up at night. And half the time it's work stuff, and half the time it's like, oh my God, I'm really worried about this thing. And that's actually great. Like having that, building that connection, it just takes some time. It doesn't happen immediately. So putting the work in and putting the time in, I think is worth it. The last thing I'll say on this is similar to Jay, checking in with yourself, but also being vulnerable with your team and in a public way of like, I am struggling. Like today is not a good day. Like I am struggling with this. I'm like, for some reason it's hitting me really hard today. And being super open about that is like, oh, that folks realize, oh, I can do that here. And it creates that culture, which is good.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed myself letting my guard down a little bit more than I'm used to. And even for myself, that's like a little bit uncomfortable. And I noticed that exactly as you said, Christina, it's a bit of a chain reaction, right? If I open up myself up to other people, then it's normalized, they're more comfortable doing it, and they might do that in return. And sometimes letting people in about what's going on can't be helped, especially with parents having kids, and especially with kids being at home now. I feel like this panel wouldn't be complete without us touching on one of the most difficult parts of working remotely, especially for the past year, and that's the unpredictability while working remotely while parenting. So I'm going to ask Allison, and then I'm going to ask Swati, what adjustments have you made as a parent to be able to work remotely, and especially over the last year, and get like as granular as you can? Because I feel like sometimes the interesting parts are in the details.
Sure. Yeah, so I feel like it's been a lot of different periods depending on where we were at in the pandemic. At the beginning, we were all home and it was a surprise. I have a 9-year-old, almost 10-year-old next week, an 8-year-old, and a 2-year-old. And so last year, I had a 1-year-old. That was a big difference, but also the older kids were in grades 2 and 3. They didn't really use computers. It was all new. We didn't have them. We were actually going through a renovation. So my house was literally torn up and they didn't have bedrooms because that's what we were renovating. So we had a bit of a chaotic time at the beginning, and they just needed me a lot. And so I transitioned to starting my day a little later so I could make sure they were at least set up and on their calls. I often had my toddler on my lap. I have a separate computer beside me, and I would show like Sesame Street on that screen, and then I could be talking to people here. So that was one of my hacks. I also had like a pack and play behind me and toys and things like that. So totally different. Now it's a different time. She is at daycare. I start my day by dropping her off. I end my day by picking her up. So it gates my time really nicely. I had to ask my husband what last summer was like, because I think I honestly blocked it out. I was like, all the kids were home. It was chaotic. I don't remember what we did. How did we survive? Anyway, turns out my sister was here to help, and I'd just totally forgotten about all of that. So that's how chaotic a year it's been. I think what I've found out is that people have a lot of empathy for everybody's different situations. You know, as a parent and somebody who's dealing with kids coming in and out and they think they're funny and they're trying to hide under my desk, or they're doing whatever they're doing, or calling you and crying, is one thing. And then there's the flip side where people are home alone all the time and they have no interaction. You know, we were able to develop this empathy for each other. And sometimes, like last week, I had a chaotic situation where my 2-year-old was at home in the morning because I had an appointment for her at noon, and I thought we would share the load between my spouse and I, and you know, life happens. It just didn't work out that way. I had to leave a really important tech design to go see her because she was screaming downstairs trying to go potty. So I brought my laptop and I spent 40 minutes sitting on the bathroom floor while she was sitting there trying to potty train her while on this tech review, with the video off, of course. And it's just like throws things at you. So I think one of the good things, if you can say there are good things that come out of a pandemic, pardon me, is that we've normalized having these interruptions, having kids in the picture. People are actually happy. I think when I'm always happy when I see somebody else's child and they smile when they see mine come into the room or do something silly. It's a welcome interruption. And they're not big distractions, I don't think. I mean, sometimes they're bigger than others, but I'd say that is nice.
Allison, you really hit it when you said empathy. I totally agree with you. I feel like there's a newfound sense of empathy, regardless of the situation. And I hope that remains and continues moving forward. For us, you know, we didn't have childcare in the beginning of the pandemic as well, and we had to quickly my partner and I had to quickly adjust schedules, right? And we also had to establish new boundaries, both at home and at work. And I think the transparency around those boundaries really helped us sort of get through that time. And also, Allison, you mentioned like it was in stages, and I totally felt like there were these chunks of times, and then we'd get through the chunk, and then we'd move on to the next chunk. But the boundaries and being transparent about those, I think, really helped set expectations for us as a family, but also, you know, with work. I used tools such as Slack await status messages, you know, making sure everybody knew like what my availability, what I was doing, and where I was if I was going to share that. I also a technique that I've actually used for a few years now, but I leaned into even more, was just making sure that my calendar was public, and so people had an opportunity to see when they were scheduling meetings that, oh, actually Swati needs to go drop off her daughter, you know, somewhere, or they're going to go for a walk, and so there's no question about like my time. You can see it. You know, I would still make private things private when I needed to, but for the most part, things were pretty transparent there. One thing that this past year has really taught me is just I never thought I would ever have this type of time with my children at this age in their life. You know, I've always worked. I enjoy what I do, and to know that I can just go out for 10 minutes outside the door and get like a hug, or you know, potentially do a meal in the middle of the day with my son, has been just so. It's changed the way that I've looked at being a working mother, and I've really embraced these moments. And I hope that they've also embraced those. I don't know, but I mean, hopefully they have, and you know, I do see the smiles. But you know, I think it's those sort of moments that are the silver lining in everything that sort of we've been experiencing the past year. And, you know, it has changed the way that I've approached both my work and my life balance.
Yeah, I think that there was also a lot of like really embedded good advice for people who are working with other parents as well, to make sure to check the calendar, to just make it normal, and to show that you're excited to see their kids, or just kind of like laugh along with it. So I think that that's really interesting, because it's just an unforeseen situation, and that we're all kind of like ebbing and flowing with it. We do have time for only one more question. And so we're going to talk a little bit about another one, which is hiring. But I know that we've gotten 2 questions posted, both by Ollie and Zach. So if you, afterwards, when we're done, if you come into the to our Slack conversation, we'll make sure that we answer the questions there. So this last question is about hiring. This is for Jay and Christina. How do you interview and onboard new hires, and how do you make it successful?
Yeah, I can kick it off with touching on interviewing. So for us, we have super clear rubrics for each role type, and then a hiring plan for the specific openings in the roles. And that hiring plan kind of tells us what the interview stages are, what needs to be covered in each stage, and also kind of a grading of what good looks like in each of those different stages. So I think that's just good practice, period. But like really setting that is important. Our interviews are over Zoom. We do them all through video. So typically they have a couple of interviewers in them. So one person can take notes while the other person's focused on asking questions and interacting in a more personal way. And then we switch off. So that actually works really well. And then for each role in engineering, at least, we sort of have an at-home project. If it's an engineering role, it's a technical coding project. If it's a management or leadership role, it's more of a like project presentation or architecture presentation about something that they've worked on before with a team. And part of this is assessing skill set, right? But part of it is also assessing how they write and communicate, because that's a super important part of remote. So if somebody can't communicate in a written form or in a presentation or in some way like that, that is really hard, completely remote. It makes it difficult. So I think, yeah, the last thing is that we also make sure in those interview stages that folks meet a broad swath of people, like managers, engineers, product managers, like different folks along the way, so that they get a true sense of the organization and that more of the organization gets a true sense of that candidate as well. So it works well both ways. And that's helped to try and just get a little bit more of the person that's the candidate in that interviewing process. But I'll turn it to Jay for some onboarding stuff.
Yeah, my observation on this, and you said it really well, is like, this is good practice anyway. Once you kind of bring good practices into remote, that's the difference between kind of success or up to that like individual's tenacity towards, you know, they're kind of setting their own destiny, which is not what you want. You don't want new people coming in and only succeeding because of their own kind of tenacity to overcome obstacles. And there's been a lot of adversity. And so you want to make sure that your practices that you have support where the default outcome is success. And the way you do that is like, hey, these are good practices. And then you make them mandatory practices as well. So like with onboarding, you really want to make sure that everything is set up. Like the worst experience, and we had this when we were growing our Seattle office, somebody showed up on day one and they just kind of got copied out of a spreadsheet and nobody knew they were going to show up. Like that's the stuff you can't do when we're remote. And so making sure that your processes are really, really good and that everybody follows them. And then the onboarding experience relates to the connection and the community that people have. So if you have a really good onboarding experience, by the time you exit that, you know enough people in the org that you don't feel alienated or alone or, oh, I only know like the 4 people on my team. And so our onboarding process in engineering is specifically designed to do that, to kind of break you out. So you don't even really spend a lot of time with your team until week 3. Like you're writing code, and our goal is to get people writing code very quickly, but you're with a different group so that you're kind of understanding familiar concepts. And if you're a very senior, like staff, principal, distinguished engineer level, what are like a cross-org project that we can drop them into? Not necessarily like, here's the deep end of the pool, have fun, but, you know, shadow, learn from our other very senior engineers on what they're doing and what they're working on and kind of what's expected of that role. Because that's a different job. Like, you know, the principal engineer is not just like a senior engineer that can code twice as good. That's not what we want. And so the faster that we introduce them to what that job looks like and the people they're going to be doing that job with, then the better off they're understanding the role. And then also they're meeting people that are going to help them. And the number one thing is really normalize reaching out to people. Like we have Donut, I think, and most people do. That may not be good enough. Just normalize the practice of saying like, hey, I want to talk and hear about your work, and making introductions. And people who've been at the company longer, they're the ones who should be driving that. And then new people should be kind of told like, hey, day one, our culture is you reach out. Like if somebody's working on something cool, they sent a cool email, just ping them and say, hey, I want to hear more about that. And you know, we try to do that, and a lot of people have like kind of developed the practice here. And as we went remote, that has really, really helped people not feel alienated.
Yeah, I think there's no better way to understand what your processes are, what your values are, what your culture is, than putting together an onboarding plan and trying to see what you're doing. And that's actually something that we're in the process of doing right now. And this entire panel has reminded me to take an audit of like what we're documenting, what our values are, whether it's normalized to show unpolished work, how we're ensuring that people are looking at calendars and what those norms are, making sure we document even those norms and the processes that we're creating to solve the problems that we have today. So I picked up so much here, and it's clear from this panel that even though we do come from these different backgrounds, these different experiences, these different responsibilities, that we have had like a pretty good, like a lot of similarities in a sense of like what it means to work remotely. And so I think one of the most important parts that I think is like an undertone for this is that it is a commitment to make remote working work well. And that carries a lot of weight. So with that, we're basically at time. I want to thank you all so much, especially your panelists, for having these incredible insights and like getting my wheels turning. I hope you all feel the same way. We're going to be taking questions now in the Lead Dev Slack. And so that's in the #remote-working channel. And so you can head there, we can continue the conversation. I'm going to post in a few questions that we got throughout the panel so that we can start getting those answers in. And thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.